1 Corinthians 9. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment of me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have the right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. But I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. For I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize.
Well, with today's passage, we've now entered into what is the second half of this letter. And this here in some ways is a bit of a key chapter, as it brings a few things together that have been talked about before, but now goes on to explain just what it is that Paul stands for and why these issues that he's addressed so far at the start of the letter are actually so important. So far in 1 Corinthians, we've seen the need for unity in the church. And Paul's saying that this unity can only come about if Jesus is the center of everything. That if you try to use anything else in order to bring the people together, that what you're using cannot be the true gospel, and it will ultimately lead to divisions in the church. And this is because some people will support one thing, but others will support another, and the church will get pulled in separate directions as each fights for their own causes. They're not on the same page. And likewise, understand that the gospel is the power of God through Christ will stop the church from following individual leaders, as well as stopping it from buying into what are worldly philosophies, because it will know that it's only by God's power that the church can ever grow and that ministry can actually happen. And as we've seen in recent chapters, the focus of this letter has moved to Paul speaking about the individual rights of people and saying that whilst you have this freedom now in Christ, don't ever use that freedom to sin, nor hide behind your rights to do what you want if it doesn't actually benefit the work of the gospel. And make sure that whatever it is that you do, it's to build each other up and to be growing God's kingdom so more people will have their faith in Jesus, and all this will bring glory to God. And these arguments by Paul have all been in the context of a church that's been pulled back into what is a very immoral society as it falls for the lies of the world, as well as fighting those who have now come into the church and they're now undermining all the ministry that he and Apollos and others have done as they are seeking to take control of the place. Hence why this becomes the critical chapter when it comes to understanding what it is that drives Paul as he keeps pushing and persisting in his mission, despite all these setbacks that he's facing, and how it is that he's able to keep his motivation when it would probably just be easy to just walk away, just to give up on it. We've got to remember when Paul wrote this letter, he's actually gone through quite a lot. A lot has happened in his life from the run up to writing this. He's been beaten, he's been falsely accused, he's been thrown in jail, and he actually isn't that young anymore. We've seen letters written not long after this. He sees Timothy as a bit of a son, a young man who will then one day take up the task of doing what Paul is unable to do once he leaves this world. And he even said in chapter 4 of this letter that he would actually send Timothy to them to help them in their current situation. Yet despite how hard it's been for him through all this, we see that Paul keeps going. And we actually get the reasons for this here. We see why it is that Paul will not give up and what it is that he's actually trying to achieve. Because what we see here is what Paul's goals are, the hope that he has that lets him focus on what is the light at the end of the tunnel and not the darkness that he's found himself in. We see what it is that really basically gets Paul out of bed in the morning and how to keep proclaiming the gospel no matter what opposition he might now be facing. And looking at all this, as we go through this chapter, it's going to raise an obvious question for ourselves. Seeing what it is that motivates Paul here and what gives him the energy to keep going despite all these difficulties and these hardships, it has to make us ask ourselves, what is it that we see as a goal of our own life and in how we live out our faith? And what pushes you in your ministries and service to God? And what is it that gives you the energy to not give up? Do you have a goal that you're working towards, or are you just aimlessly wandering around, not thinking about what you are trying to achieve for God? Basically, what is it that gets you out of bed in the morning? Is it the same purpose that we see with Paul here? Do you have that same drive that he does? And also, how much are you willing to sacrifice in order to fulfill that goal? Paul was willing to sacrifice everything. Is that something that you would say is also true for you? Now, to answer that, we need to look at what Paul's actual argument is here. What is it that he states is his goal and why it is that he won't give up on that goal? And there are 4 things to consider as we look at this. 4 points that we're going to break this passage up into as we see just what Paul lives for by seeing what he lives for and what his goal is and what drives him, we're also seeing what example that sets for us and how we can know how to live our life for God. So the first thing to see here in this chapter is that Paul makes an argument for his authority and how as an apostle and as a teacher to the church, he should actually be given a level of support and even be given compensation for his efforts. Learned this by the work that he's done. He starts off in verses 1 and 2 by explaining how he is a true apostle and he's not some fraud. So he should be treated like anyone else who claims the same position as himself. And he makes an interesting comment in verse 2, which, based on what we saw earlier on in the book when we started this series, indicates that not everyone believes that he actually has this status as an apostle, that people are in fact questioning his authority. So he says here, even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you. Which means that we see here that Paul acknowledges the fact that there are others out there who do question his authority. Some will say that he's not an apostle, and he therefore should not be given the rights of one. But whilst he's acknowledging that others may think that way, he's saying that as a church, you should not be thinking like that, as you know that I am one. You know me. As he says in verse 1, he reminds them that he has seen the Lord Jesus. So this is why we don't have apostles today. Because to be a true apostle, you had to have seen Jesus with your own eyes. You had to have seen the resurrected Jesus. So you could then be a witness to the truth and then take that gospel message out to the world. And as we know, Paul did in fact see Jesus. He saw him on the road to Damascus, hence why he became a Christian. This was his moment of realization. And as we also saw in Acts, Jesus speaks directly to Paul and tells him that he must go to Rome to stand in front of Caesar, to be that witness of the gospel message. So Paul already qualifies as an apostle because of the things that have happened in his past and things that he's already done long before he actually went to Corinth, long before he started this church. But then he says to the church here, are you not the result of my work in the Lord? And he also says, you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. So what he's saying here is, you, the Corinthian church, are the proof that I'm an apostle. You are here only because I'm a true apostle of Jesus that brought you the gospel message. And this is why he says in verse 3, he says, this is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. So in verse 3, he's talking about the points that he just made in 1 and 2 to show that he is an apostle. He's saying, Jesus sent me to you, and you wouldn't know him if he didn't do that. So you actually are the proof of who I claim to be. You as a church that I set up proves that I've been sent by Jesus himself. So Paul's first point here is that he's a true apostle. And no matter what anyone else says about him, all these people trying to pull him down and judge him, it doesn't change the reality. It doesn't change his calling by Jesus. And those in the Corinthian church, they should actually know this. Right? They, better than anyone, should know who Paul is, and the fact that they are even there actually only proves who he claims to be. He started this Corinthian church because, if you remember, he was Jesus' chosen instrument to bring the gospel message to the Gentiles. Now, having made this argument for his apostleship, and therefore the fact that he should be seen as a servant of Christ and not as a false teacher, after making that argument, he then moves on to saying what rights this gives him. The fact that he is a true apostle means that he has certain rights that he can claim upon, just like anyone else who is in that same position, anyone else who happens to be an apostle. So starting in verse 4, we see this list of rhetorical questions, which are there to make the point about what rights Paul should have. So he asks them, in regards to being an apostle, don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? So what he's saying here is, these other people are having their needs met, right? They get given this treatment, these other apostles and other church leaders. They get fed and they get to bring their family along with them as a ministry, and they have their expenses paid for, and they have no one telling them otherwise. No one saying, no, we're not going to do this. Hence that question in verse 6, that if this is how an apostle gets treated, if this is how a church leader is to be treated, why do people then want to deny these same rights to him and Barnabas? He asks them, or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? So he's showing this double standard that's going on in the church here. These people who are totally fine with someone like Peter, that's Cephas, Peter, being well cared for. But as soon as Paul shows up, they start making these new rules for him. They start making new ways to judge him that doesn't actually apply to anyone else. And it is really difficult and even horrible when you see this happen in the church. I remember being in the church with a youth minister who was actually one of the worst at this. If some leader took a night off for, say, a family reason, they were the good Christian, loving their family as, the Bible says to do. But if someone else took a night off for maybe even some more serious family reasons, well, it showed that they weren't really committed. They've skipped a night, they're not really set on it. And if someone went above and beyond and organised an extra event outside of, the normal calendar of events, it showed their motivation and their desire for gospel work. But if someone else did the same thing, it showed their lack of teamwork because they're organising things by themselves on the side. So in other words, it didn't matter what someone does or doesn't do, it's who does it that matters, right? That's the criteria it's actually being judged. Are they a favoured person who gets all the praise for everything they do? Or are they an unwanted person where everything they say and do can and will be used against them? And that's what's happening with Paul here in this church at Corinth. The others get this treatment, this good treatment. They get all the support. But then he, who does the same thing, gets treated like a freeloader. If he was to claim the same rights as them, they'll judge him for it. When they serve the church, they get compensated. But when he does it, they deny him that right. But what Paul's arguing here is that not only is he an apostle, just like Peter, and therefore should be treated the same. He should get the same benefits. He also then goes on to show that this is only the right thing to do, as compensating God's workers has actually been God's way from the start. So look at verses 7 and following. Again, he asks a string of questions that have obvious answers for anyone who's thinking straight and actually trying to be fair. So he asks in verse 7, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? So what Paul's making clear here is that the person doing the work obviously enjoys some of the fruit of their labor. That is only fair that someone gets compensated for the work that they do. But he then goes on to explain that this is not just common sense. It's actually God's ways. God is the one who says that this is right. And it's even, in fact, in God's law. So he says in verse 8, do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? And then we see he actually quotes from the law. He says, for it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. And just in case I don't get the connection that he's trying to make here with this quote, he then says, is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. So what's Paul's argument here is, God always planned for those who do the work to be rewarded by that work. That what they do in order to get results means that they're entitled to some of that end product, right? They should be compensated. Hence why then he says in 11 and 12, we have sown spiritual seed among you. Is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? So here he is making the argument for his rights. He's making a case for his rightful compensation. Some want to pay others, these other apostles, but then make the claim that the apostle Paul is not entitled to these same things. Paul, who does more than any of these other people, he gets nothing, but they get taken care of. And this is obviously unfair. It's blatant double standards. And he shouldn't have to fight for what is rightfully his. And as he goes on in 13 and 14, he makes this point even clearer. Because he says here, don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. So Paul is not doing anything wrong if he gets supported or even paid for the ministry that he's doing. Because this is what God has in mind. Those who serve in his temple, those who serve in his church, should not be left to starve because they're too busy working the gospel message to be out there working in a field to feed themselves. That this is not just common sense, but it's actually the structure that God has put in place, and therefore it should be respected. Something that those in the church, in their hatred of Paul, are willing to discard because it doesn't fit their agenda. Right? They're so determined to find fault with him. They would actually use what is his rightful compensation for doing his job as an excuse to then criticize him and undermine his authority and position as an apostle. So there's the second point this morning. The first one was that he's a true apostle, and they should know that better than anyone, as they're the proof of his authority as an apostle. But the second one is that if he is an apostle, and this is how apostles are to be treated, and this is how other apostles are being treated, then he should be given the same rights as anyone else. That this argument that others should be given food and a wage and all this support, but he, for some reason, doesn't qualify. Well, it's both illogical when you look at how others are compensated for their work, like a soldier, for example. But worse still, this is also going against God's ways. God is the one who says that people deserve a wage for their work, so Paul should not be excluded from that. They have no right to impose on him these rules that actually take away what are his God-given rights. But this is where the argument now takes a twist. Because so far, he's laid out a defense for the situation. And he's claimed his rights to be compensated for his troubles. But now he goes on to say that even though he has these rights, he hasn't used them. That yes, he has these rights, but despite that, he actually hasn't made a claim on them. We see halfway through verse 12, he states, we didn't use this right. And then in verse 15, he also says, but I have not used any of these rights. And the reason for this, the reason Paul's not claimed them, despite having just laid out an argument as to why he could and in fact even should claim them, it's actually going to link back into something that was spoken of earlier in this letter. As said at the start, this chapter does bring several things together. And this is where it hits on a very big theme that runs through 1 Corinthians. Back in chapter 6, Paul talked about how even if I have the right to take someone to court because someone's wronged them, that they shouldn't do that because it makes the church look bad taking Christians to a secular court. That they can take people to court to be fairly compensated for wrong that has been done to them. But if doing that then damages the church, then don't do it. Right? Don't claim your rights, but instead just wear the cost for the church's sake. For the sake of the gospel, they're best not to use their rights, but instead they should forfeit them so as to not cause harm to the ministry. And in a similar way, as we saw, or some of us saw in our Connect Bible study groups last cycle, in chapter 8, just before this one, Paul there talks about the fact that Christians are free to eat meat, even meat sacrificed to idols. And they can go down to the marketplace where this meat is being sold, or even to a temple which is dedicated and built to a false god. And even though that these things, why they're happening and what they stand for, even though they're all wrong, Christians have the right and freedom to go to these places and to eat what they're offering, because they know that it's all fake, it's all false. And they're not denying the gospel by doing this. They're not being tricked into believing something that is wrong. But then after that, after making that argument, he also goes on to say that if this causes another Christian, a weaker brother, someone else to stumble, and that damages their faith, then he will give up that right, as the other person is more important than his rights. So he says in chapter 8, verse 9, just before this passage, this is what he was talking about, just before we get to chapter 9 today. He says, "Be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak." And then says in verse 13 of the last chapter, "Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall." So Paul has, on more than one occasion now, made the statement that you have these rights. But if exercising those rights causes problems and harm for the ministry and those in the church, don't claim them. Give up your right for the sake of the gospel, because that is more important than your rights. And that is what we're seeing here. After making this argument for his rights, Paul then says in verse 12, "But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ." So because of the gospel of Jesus and the damage that could happen to that ministry if he was to claim every one of his rights, Paul has instead decided to do it hard, as he doesn't want to hinder the work that he's doing. Because Paul knows that if he claimed his compensation, that others would say that he's just doing it for the money, and others would claim that he's just trying to build reputation. He doesn't want to give them the ammunition to do this. But as we see in verses 15 and 17, he can go without his rights because he isn't doing this for reward, nor is he doing it for any kind of praise. In fact, he says he does all this because this is what God has set him apart to do. He's just doing his calling. So this is why he says in verse 18, "What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel." Paul's so determined to make sure that he doesn't damage the message by claiming his rights that he's willing to give them all up, whatever that may cost him. He doesn't want people to see or say that he's selling religion or he's in it for the profit, and that would therefore undermine his ministry. Because we do see today just how bad it looks when these mega church pastors turn up to church in their chauffeur-driven limousine, having just come from an airport that they flew into in their privately owned jet plane. All right, men who are clearly in it just for worldly reward. They're in it for the praise and the money. And then look at how many people want to leave the church over that. You know, how it drives people away as it makes the church look like it is, in fact, selling religion. And Paul is saying, even if I have the right to fair treatment and fair compensation, if that gives people reason for concern, or if it gives others ammunition to undermine his authority and therefore undermine the ministry, then he doesn't want it. It's his right, but he's saying, I don't want to claim it because I care more about the church than whatever compensation I might be owed. And then as we move on, we see the bigger reason as to why he thinks this way. We see how Paul views his ministry and what it is that drives him to make these sacrifices for the gospel message. So he then says in verse 19, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. And then after talking about becoming a Jew to win the Jews, and without saying it specifically, being a Gentile to the Gentiles, that's what he means by those without the law. After making these statements, he then says in verses 22 and 23, I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel that I might share in its blessings. So what Paul's saying here is, I have rights, I have freedom, and I give them all up for the purpose of bringing people to Christ. That this is Paul's main motive. He looks to what is the end goal. He sees where he wants to get to, and if he has to give up a few things now in order to get there, then that's what he does. Like working extra hours to save up for something special, taking a holiday or something, or doing that extra exercise today so in order to be fitter tomorrow. It's the same thing going on here. Paul's looking at where he wants the church to be. And if he has to sacrifice his rights and freedoms now to get there, then that's the cost. So he keeps his eye on the goal of taking the gospel message out to everyone, everywhere. And then he does whatever needs to be done in order to make that happen. Right? For the sake of the gospel message, he gives up his rights as he doesn't want those rights to get in the way of what is his main objective. So there's our third point this morning. Paul's made his argument for his rights as a true apostle and the fact that he is actually owed something. But now he says that he doesn't take it. And he doesn't take it because the gospel work is more important. And if claiming his rights damages that work, then it's better to go without. His main objective is for all people to know Jesus. So whatever his own needs are today, well, they're irrelevant compared to the final outcome. Which leads us to our last point. And that is looking at what it takes to make this sacrifice that Paul's making here. So far, he's explained why he has these rights and he's explained why he's given them up and what he wants to achieve. But he has one last thing to say now when it comes to the commitment it takes in order to reach this goal. He's made it clear just how far he's willing to go, but now he's going to say what the cost of this is and why he's actually willing to pay it. And what is it that motivates him to not give in? And he uses what is an easy to understand illustration. An illustration that would be especially easy to understand for the Corinthians, because this is something that they could very much relate to. Because he says in verse 24, do you know that in a race, all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. See, today we have, what is called the Olympic Games. And most of us are probably aware of the history going back to Greece at this time and how it was such a big part of their culture. And back then, just as today, the Olympic Games were held every 4 years. But what's less known today is that there were other games on at that time. There are actually 4 big athletic events held at different times over the 4 years, with the Olympics being just one of these games. And one of those 4 was what was called the Isthmian Games. And these games were held at Corinth. Every couple of years, they'd have these games at Corinth. So they get this illustration, right? They get this. They understand the whole Greek athletics thing better than most people. So they would know what it takes to be a success at the games. That if you are going to win gold, you absolutely have to commit everything, your entire life in order to achieve that. And what Paul's saying here is, if you're going to be serious about taking out the gospel, if you're going to be like himself, and if you're going to be prepared to do whatever it takes to tell the world about Jesus, then he's actually like competing in these games. This is why he says in the last couple of verses, therefore I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. So he's making the point that like an athlete who keeps their eyes on the main prize, the main goal, what it is that they're in the race for, what it is they're trying to achieve. That's actually the same with ministry. He's saying he puts himself through all this because that's what he's focused on, this end goal. He's not concerned with the things of this world and the things that this world has to offer. So he doesn't need this compensation, which basically is things of this world. He doesn't need the praise. He doesn't need a reward from them or anyone else, because he's looking at the big prize. He's looking at the outcome of his ministry. And he knows that his compensation will come from God himself. God will reward his services. So those at Corinth can keep their paycheck. He doesn't want it. Instead, all he cares about is spreading the gospel. All he cares about is serving Jesus, and that's what he keeps his eyes on. But he also says something else, which is very important in verse 25. Because after making this comparison about how an athlete focuses on the prize, on that main goal, and that is exactly what ministry's got to be like. We've got to have that same attitude. He then says, they do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. So all that work that an athlete does, all that training, all that sacrifice, they do it for basically a trophy that doesn't last, and one that people forget in the future. Someone will win that same race again in 4 years from now. So none of it matters, right? In the big scheme of things, it's all going to get forgotten. But unlike athletics, ministry, each of us serving Jesus, the gospel work, well, that results in a crown that lasts forever. That service and sacrifice for God today, God will reward that with something eternal. So Paul will get compensated for his work. He'll get compensated with the greatest prize anyone could ever be given. Eternal life with God in heaven, having received his, i.e. God's approval. So whatever it is that Paul gives up now in this life, the struggles that he has to go through for all this ministry that he's doing, basically his attitude is, well, who cares? When you look at it from what is Paul's point of view, sacrificing his rights today, it's a small price to pay when you look at what is the end goal, that final outcome. So there's our last point for this morning. First, that Paul is a true apostle. Second, that being a true apostle means that he has the rights as an apostle. Third, that he's actually given up those rights for the gospel. And lastly, he does this with no regret as he keeps his eyes on the prize, that end goal, as that is what everything he's doing, he's working towards. If it was about this life now, he'd really just be wasting his time. If his life was all that mattered, then his sacrifice would actually end up being for nothing. But because he looks towards heaven and the end result of his gospel work, then he's motivated every day to not give up, but to keep striving as hard as he can. But of course, this all brings us back to that question at the start. The question for each of us to be asking ourselves. What is your goal? What is it you want to achieve, and are you working towards it? Because for all of us, serving God should be the priority, right? That's got to be the main focus in our life. Living out our service to Jesus as we wait the day he returns and brings about his eternal kingdom. So we've been told, take the gospel message out. And we've been told, accept our lot in life and use everything that we've been given in order to serve him. And we should be doing this as we look towards that final destination, that eternal crown in heaven, because we've lived for the gospel now in this world. So it means focus on what needs to be achieved. Make sure you take the opportunities given to share the gospel. And that also therefore means be prepared to forego your rights. Make the sacrifice so as to best serve the ministry. And make sure that you're doing this right. Make sure that you don't get sidetracked or start putting your focus elsewhere, but live to serve only him. See, in the background picture this morning, you can see two athletes in a race. And as they're crossing the line, they're holding hands. They worked hard to get to the race. They worked hard to lead the race. And they finished together, crossing the line as equal winners. And because they crossed as equal winners, they were both immediately disqualified because it was considered to be a kind of race fixing. And it's race fixing because they didn't push for the win. They purposely organized together to slow down as they crossed the line so they could both win the race. So all that work, all that training for nothing, they lost it all. And whilst it may seem unfair, the fact is this only happened because they did take their eyes off the prize. They forgot what the goal was. They were more concerned in getting their heart-warming moment, trying to make a statement that it's not all about winning. But the reality is when you're in a competition, when you're in a race, it kind of is all about winning. I mean, that is what you're there for. As Paul even says, all the runners run, but only one gets the prize. So aiming for first place is what you need to focus on. All right, that's what you're there for. You're there to win, not make feel-good statements that look good on camera. It was a nice sentiment, right? It did show a kind of a sporting sort of attitude. We're all friends. We're all sort of, cooperating together. But it actually defeats the whole point of having a prize if everyone just shares it, if everyone's a winner. So that means you have to keep your eyes on the prize. The ultimate goal, you're there to win the race, not to make personal statements. And for Paul, that ultimate goal, the prize, was seeing Jesus as king and serving him. And we all need to make sure that this is our focus as well, that we actually have the same attitude as Paul, and that we don't make the mistakes that would get us disqualified, that we don't start looking for other things other than seeing that big goal. So ask yourself this week, as you go out, ask, do you need to maybe make changes? Are there things you need to cut off that are getting in the way of the prize, distracting you from that goal? Do you have that goal clear in your mind? And will that be the first thing that you think of, right, when you get out of bed each morning? Or will you let the things of this world become what you're actually living for? Will they become the things that you focus on? So the message here is, if you know what the goal is, then you can be and need to be prepared to give up everything to achieve it. You know what it is that you're after. And if you do keep your eyes on the prize, then you'll be prepared to do what it takes, because you'll actually see how little everything is in comparison. It's like Paul here is saying, make sure you know what you're here for, and that is to live for Jesus, to spread his gospel, and forfeit whatever right or whatever other thing could possibly get in the way of that goal.